So first of all, thank you very much to Dean and all the other people who I'm sure are involved in running this conference for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be here. It's obviously an unusual kind of gathering, which is fun. I think every talk we've had so far has been entirely different from the others, and this one will be no exception. So I'm a philosopher, a psychologist or an historian. In fact, I'm a sort of logician, but you can relax, I'm not going to give you any hardcore logic in this talk. What I want to talk about, well, this is not quite the talk title that was advertised. I think the title that was advertised was Nothing is Something. That would do just as well, in fact. But I had a look at the esteemed lineup of those present, and I thought I'd make it a bit sexier. So it's actually called Ex Nihilo Omnis Fit. And you may recognize this guy, you may not. I'll tell you who he is in a minute, all right? You may be able to translate the title if you've got schoolboy or schoolgirl Latin. It's actually a perversion of a well-known medieval saying, ex nihilo nihil fit, okay? Which means from nothing comes nothing. From nothing, nothing comes. Whereas my title, ex nihilo omnis fit, is from nothing, everything comes. So everything comes from nothing. I can't claim that it's an original thought, okay? Because a few people have endorsed this, including the guy whose picture you just saw now, who is Meister Eckhart, okay? Who said, and now I got this from a book of quotations. I haven't been able to track down the original source, but I think it's legit, okay? All things are created out of nothingness, and thus their true origin is the non. I guess he was speaking Latin, okay. So what he's saying is everything comes from nothingness. Well, Eckhart is a mystic, for sure, and identifies the Godhead with nothingness. So this is just an Eckhardian version of the Christian claim that God created everything out of, God created everything. Okay. I actually think that Eckhart got it right. Not, well, sort of. Okay. And the point of this talk is to explain what I think he got right. Okay. Ex nihilo nihil fit. There are real questions about how you can understand this to make sense of it. Okay? So really that's what I'm going to talk about. So first of all, there's the fit. Made. If everything is made by nothing or depends on nothing, what do you mean by made? Okay, well, we'll get to that. But there's a kind of prior question, which is the nihil. Nothing. All right, now, nothingness is a very important notion in both Eastern and Western philosophy. It plays a role in the Kyoto School, as we heard very nicely this morning. It plays a role in Sartre, in Heidegger, in Hegel. And it's, you can explain what it is to a 5-year-old, right? Roughly, it's what's left when you take everything away. Easy. But you don't have to think about it very long to realize that it's deeply embroiled in paradox. Because nothing is, well, nothing, no thing, okay? But it is something. I mean, I'm talking about it, we've been talking about it all day, you're thinking about it now, unless you've had one of these momentary sort of lapses of consciousness we've been hearing about. So it's nothing and it's something. Oh, that's a contradiction. And people start to shuffle their feet when they hear about contradictions, okay? What is this nothingness? All right, so that's the first thing I want to talk about. So I'm going to talk about nihil first, and then when we've done that, we'll come back to the fit. Okay, so we've had the introduction. I'm going to start by having a closer look at the paradox. We'll talk about nothingness. Dean, can you remove the cursor, which is pointing at nothingness? Thank you. Okay. And then, depending on the time, I might have a little bit of a chat about the principle of non-contradiction, and then we'll get on to the fit, the ontological dependence, and I'll tell you how it is that nothingness is the ground of reality. So I'll wake you up at that point if you've gone to sleep, all right? And then it'll end. So let's have a closer look at the paradox. Okay, now the first thing you've got to realise is that the word nothing is highly ambiguous, right? First of all, it can be what logicians call a quantifier phrase. So a quantifier phrase is something like something, everything, all, many, most. It doesn't refer to anything. It just tells you that some bunch of things, like cats, there are some of them, all of them, none of them, many of them, most of them. That's what logicians call a quantifier phrase. And nothing can be a quantifier phrase. So, for example, suppose I ask someone a question and she doesn't reply. I might say, she said nothing. That's the quantifier phrase, okay? And it means in kind of a logician might write it, for no X did she say X. Okay? That's the quantifier phrase. But the word nothing can also be a noun phrase, a substantive. It's synonymous in that, guys, with nothingness, which makes its nounity obvious, right? And although some philosophers have denied that the word nothing can be a noun phrase, it clearly can. So, for example, suppose I say Heidegger wrote about nothing. I certainly don't mean for no X did Heidegger write about X. That wouldn't be true, okay? He wrote about nothingness, das nicht. Suppose I say Heidegger and Hegel wrote about nothing but said quite different things about it. The it is an anaphoric pronoun which refers back to the thing referred to by the word nothing. A fortiori, it refers to something. Okay. So, the fact that the word nothing is ambiguous can cause, it's a great source of puns, okay? If you read Lewis Carroll, you'll find many of them. So, for example, when Alice meets the White King, the White King says, can you see anyone coming down the road? And Alice says, I can see no one. And the White King says, gee, you've got such great eyes, it's as much as I can do to see real people. Okay, this is a Carrollian joke. Alice is using the word as a quantifier. There's no X such that she can see X. But the king takes her to be referring to something. And since it's a no one, it's a non-existent object, okay? That's the pun. Okay, and the pun's funny. But the ambiguity of the word nothing can be a source of great confusion. And I'm afraid if you read discussions of nothing, you will find them often very confused, okay? Because it's easy to slide from the noun phrase to the quantifier and back, and they are different. Quantifier phrases do not refer to objects. Their grammatical, their logical function is entirely different. Okay, so when I use the word nothing as a noun phrase, well, in writing, I'm going to boldface it. Okay, it's kind of hard to do that when you're talking. You can go nothing. Okay, but I will try to, when I speak, use the word nothing as the noun phrase, and when I mean the quantifier, I will say no thing, like something, everything, no thing. So that's the first bit of clarification. We're going to be talking about nothing, okay, the thing. All right, next bit of clarification. we're talking about whether nothing is something or no thing. What's a thing? What's an object? Okay. Well, so we're interested in what it means to say X is something or an object. What does that mean? Well, simply, to be something is X is something if for some Y, Y is X. So X is an object, X is something if for some Y, Y is X. Okay, that's pretty obvious. Mathematicians will write the is like this, the is of identity. Okay, so X is an object is just to say for some Y, X is Y. And X is X, everything is self-identical. So for some Y, X is Y, and then we take X itself. So everything is an object. No surprises there, it's obvious, right? But if X is not an object, what does that mean? Well, it means for no Y, X is Y. In other words, it's not the case that X is X, because if for no Y, Y is X, then that's true of X. So X isn't X. That is, mathematicians write it like this. So if X isn't an object, it's not self-identical. All right, so those are some very simple facts about nothing and about objects. Okay, so that's all the preliminary clarification. Now let's get back to our paradox close-up. So the paradox was that nothing is something and no thing, right? So nothing is something, that is for some Y, Y is nothing. And nothing is no thing, okay? That is, it's not something. That is, it's not the case that for some Y, Y is nothing. And now the paradox, the contradiction is manifest, it's patent. Okay. So, nothingness is both something and not something. All right. Why should you suppose those are true? Well, the first one is pretty straightforward. Namely, everything is something, so nothing is something. Okay, a nice simple argument. You might not like it. Let me give you another argument. In fact, we've already heard it a bit today. Look. We're talking about nothing now. And nothing is the content of what we're talking about. So if you're talking about Katoomba, Katoomba is the content of what you're talking about or thinking about or whatever. If you're talking or thinking about Sherlock Holmes, Sherlock Holmes is the content of the topic or the object that you're talking about. Sherlock Holmes doesn't exist. But we often talk about and think about non-existent things. We do it all the time. And in the same way, if you're thinking about nothing, as you are now, then nothing is the subject, the content, the object of your thought. So nothing is something, namely the content of your thought. Okay. So if you're thinking about nothing, you're thinking about something. So that's two reasons to think that one is true. Nothing is something. But what about two? Nothing is nothing. Okay. So why might you think that that is true? Well, as I told you, you can explain to a 5-year-old what nothing is. It's what remains when everything is removed. Everything, every object. So, since every object has been removed, no thing is left. So nothing is no thing. All right, that's okay, but it's a bit of a kind of metaphor. You know, nothing is what remains when everything is removed. That's okay, but we can do better than that. So what we can do is I'm going to tell you exactly what nothing is. And I'm going to do that with the help of something called mereology. So mereology is the theory of parts and wholes, comes from the Greek meros, meaning part. And mereology is a well-established part of contemporary logic since the early 19th century, early 20th century, people like Husserl. And let me just give you a quick rundown on mereology. We're not going to go into any details. So things have parts, or at least most things have parts, right? Australia has states and a couple of territories. Beethoven's Ninth Symphony has 4 movements. I have arms and legs and so on. So most things are partite objects. Moreover, if you take those parts and you put them together, you get the object itself, right? So if you take the 4 movements of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony and put them all together, you get the symphony. If you take the 6 states and a couple of territories of Australia and put them together, you get Australia. And if you take my parts, my arms and legs and head, and you put them together, you get me. Okay, so this is usually called the fusion of the parts. So if you take a partite object and you put all the parts together, they fuse to get the object in question. Okay. This is all pretty commonsensical, all right? Now, I'm going to tell you that nothing is the fusion of the objects in the empty set. Let me explain what I mean. So, this thing is called by mathematicians the empty set. And it's the set which contains no things. It's a perfectly good set. It's standard in set theory. It's just the set which has nothing in it. And it's something. It's a perfectly good something. It's a perfectly good set. Okay. But there's nothing in it. All right. So let's take the empty set and let's fuse all its members. It ain't got any. And you can fuse its members together as long as you like, and you won't get any because it hasn't got any, right? If you take no thing and you fuse it with no thing and fuse it with no thing, you're going to get no thing. So, I've now told you what nothing is. And people may well use the noun no thing to mean different things. That's fine. Yeah? If you're talking about something different, we're talking about something different. But this is what I mean by it. I'm going to stick to that. And you can see it's a perfectly legitimate understanding of nothing. So nothing is the fusion of all the things in the empty set. The empty set has no members, so when you fuse them all together, you get nothing.
Are 3 no things more than 2 no things?
No. Because if you count something, okay, how many of you are there? There's you and you and you and you and you, just one.
I'm not so sure about that.
Well, I'm sure your wife is. Okay. So, nothing, I've told you what nothing is, okay? A40 or A something. I've just told you what the something is, but I've also explained why it's nothing. Because when you fuse no things together, you get nothing. All right, let's skip that. Okay, so nothing is nothing. That was the second limb of our paradox. Nothingness is something and it's nothing. That's a contradiction. And it's true. Now, let's have a few words about the principle of non-contradiction. So, I've told you that nothingness is a paradoxical object. It's a contradictory object. If you talk to most Western philosophers at this point, they'll start frothing at the mouth because they will tell you that contradictions can't be true. And you say, why? And they say, well, because Aristotle said so. Not a great answer. Okay? Everything else Aristotle said has turned out to be false, or at least highly problematic. So, in the metaphysics, Aristotle defends the principle of non-contradiction. Let me see, have we got it? No contradiction is true. Okay, that's the principle of non-contradiction. In the metaphysics, he defends the principle of non-contradiction. And he launched it into orthodoxy in Western philosophy. Eastern philosophy is a different game. We can talk about that later if you want, but I'm going to talk about just Western philosophy. So successful were his arguments that there's hardly been a sustained defense of the principle of non-contradiction in Western philosophy since Aristotle. So you'd better think that his arguments were good. They were terrible. Okay. As modern commentators on the metaphysics recognise. So there is one long argument in the passage, and it's so tortured and confused that modern commentators cannot even agree what it is, let alone that it works. Okay, so Aristotle has one long argument, and it's tortured, and it's really obscure. Then Aristotle has about half a dozen throwaway arguments of one line or one paragraph each, and the most obvious thing is that they're beside the point. Because what they establish is not that no contradictions are true. What they establish is that it's not the case that all contradictions are true, which is quite different. Okay? It's the difference between no objects are dogs, and it's not the case that every object is a dog. They're quite different. So, Aristotle's arguments were a failure, yet they did launch the principle of non-contradiction into high orthodoxy in Western philosophy. And as I said, there hasn't been a sustained defense of the principle of non-contradiction since Aristotle. Now, contemporary logicians, of whom I guess I'm one, will tell you that the principle of non-contradiction is correct. And if you ask a modern logician why the principle of non-contradiction is correct, this is what they'll tell you. There's a principle of inference called ex falso quodlibet sequitur. Let's think of it as medieval name. From a falsehood, anything follows. Sometimes it's called ex contradictione quodlibet sequitur. From a contradiction, everything follows. And what it means is that if you've got a contradiction, so this is A, this is not the case that A, and it follows that B, when A and B can be anything you like. Okay? So what it says is if you've got contradictory information, everything follows. This is the principle ex falso quodlibet sequitur. Modern logicians call this explosion, because they don't know Latin. But it's called explosion because once you've got inconsistent information, the information entails everything. So you get a explosion of information. Prima facie, that looks like a crazy principle of inference, right? So let's take some contradiction. Donald Trump is corrupt and Donald Trump is not corrupt. If the principle of explosion is valid, it follows that 2 + 2 is 3, and 4, and 17. It follows that the Earth has 17 moons and no moons. It follows that Dean is a frog, so are you, okay? That sounds crazy, okay? Because those conclusions have absolutely nothing to do with the premises. I mean, Donald Trump, corrupt or otherwise, has absolutely nothing to do with Dean being a frog. Okay, so this looks like a crazy principle of inference. So you may be surprised to know that it's absolutely orthodox in modern logic. And of course, if the principle of inference is correct, then if you've got a contradiction, everything is true. Now, you know, that really is too much. To think that nothing is both no thing and something is one thing, but to think that Dean is a frog, or a frog and not a frog, is just silly. So, as I say, if you ask a contemporary logician why the principle of non-contradiction must hold, they will tell you about this principle of inference. Okay. So why do modern logicians think that this is a valid principle of inference? Let me show you. Logicians disagree about what makes an inference valid, okay? It's a subject of contention. But something like this is generally agreed upon. An inference is valid if it's impossible for its premises to be true and its conclusion false. You know, you can't have true premises and a false conclusion if you've got a valid argument. All right. Let me say that again. An inference is valid if it's impossible for it to have true premises and a false conclusion. Suppose the premises are a contradiction. Then, the argument goes, it's impossible for them to be true. A fortiori, it's impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false. So, the inference is valid. Sometimes logicians will say that the inference is vacuously valid because the premises just can't be true together. All right, so that's why contemporary logicians will tell you that the principle of explosion is valid, and that's why they will reject the law of non-contradiction. But if you think about it for a second, this is a terrible argument against the principle of non-contradiction because it assumes it, right? So the argument went, hey, the premises can never be true, so a fortiori, it can't be the case that the premises are true and the conclusion is false, so the inference is valid. But obviously, that just assumes that the contradictions can't be true. So if you're giving this as an argument that contradictions can't be true, it simply begs the question. It's not just Aristotle's arguments against the principle of non-contradiction which are hopeless. Even the tools of modern logic, or using the tools of modern logic to try to show that the law of non-contradiction is not true, is hopeless too. And in fact, what we've seen in the last 50 or 60 years is the development of a kind of logic called paraconsistent logic. Now, I'm not going to go into the details, but a paraconsistent logic is exactly one where the principle of explosion fails. Okay. Paraconsistent logics are contentious, but if you think that some contradictions are true, then that's exactly the kind of logic that you need. Okay. So, paraconsistent logics have been used to address a lot of logical paradoxes, like Russell's paradox, like the liar paradox. If you don't know what those are, I won't tell you now, but I'll explain in the discussion if you want. But if you think nothing is a paradoxical object, you're going to have to use a paraconsistent logic, and I think that's exactly what you should do. All right, so that is the end of the interlude on the principle of non-contradiction. So, remember what we're doing. We're talking about this principle ex nihilo omnis fit. So, I've told you what nothing is. I've defined it for you. I've told you it's paradoxical. And I've told you why that's okay. Because it's okay that some contradictions are true. All right. So we've done the nihil. Now let's come to the fit. Okay. What does it mean to say that everything depends on nothing? Okay. Well, we're dealing with ontological dependence. Right? Everything depends on nothing. Ontological dependence is a very common sense notion. It features in lots of Western philosophy. It features in lots of Eastern philosophy. In Orthodox Christianity, God's creatures depend on God. But there are much more banal examples. The shadow of a tree depends on the tree, not the other way around. Okay? The notion of ontological dependence has come in for a lot of discussion in analytic metaphysics in the last 30 years. So, you know, philosophers have been thinking a lot about this, and I'm not going to say a lot, but I'll say a few things just to give you, you know, an idea of what's been going on. So, in Christianity, God's creatures depend on God. Okay, and one sense in which that's true is that God brought everything else into existence at some time. But the dependence of God's creatures on God is actually much more profound than that in Orthodox Christianity. The dependence is not simply that God was the creator at some time. The dependence is per se. And what that means is, it's not just the bringing into existence that God is responsible for, but it's the maintaining existence. That's dependence per se. So, God's creatures depend on God in the way that the motion of the carriage of a train depends on the train's locomotive itself, right? The carriage moves, and the movement depends on the engine. It's the engine which maintains the train's carriages in motion. In the same way, the shadow of a tree depends on the tree per se. It's not just that the tree brings the shadow into existence, which it does, but it maintains it into existence. You got rid of the tree, the shadow of the tree would disappear. Okay. So when we're talking about ontological dependence, that's the kind of dependence we're talking about. Dependence per se. All right. So what does it mean for something to depend on something else in that way? Let me give you a couple of examples. So let's come back to the tree. The shadow of the, if S is the shadow of a tree, it depends for being what it is on the tree T. And what does that mean? Well, you can put it as a counterfactual. Had T not been a tree, S would not have been the shadow of a tree. Doesn't go the other way, because if S hadn't been the shadow of a tree, it doesn't follow that T wouldn't have been a tree, the sun might have gone in. Okay? But it certainly follows this way, right? Had T not been a tree, S would not have been the shadow of a tree. That's what it means to say that the shadow being what it is depends on the tree. Here's another example. A molecule of water, M, depends for being what it is on containing an atom of oxygen, A. Had A not been a matter of been an atom of oxygen, M would not have been a molecule of water. So if A had been an atom of nitrogen, M would not have been a molecule of water. Okay, again, it's a kind of counterfactual, it doesn't go the other way. So that's sort of positive dependence, right? But dependence can be negative as well. So S being the spouse of some person P depends on S being distinct from a different person from P. Because if S were the same person as P, then S would not be the spouse of P. You can't marry yourself. Okay, so that's a negative dependence. Here's another one. H being a hill depends on H being distinct from the surrounding plane. If H were the same height as the plane, then H would not be a hill. Okay, so these are negative dependencies, differences. Okay, so those are some examples of ontological dependence, and that's all I want to say by way of general things about ontological dependence. Let's get back to being an object and nothingness. Okay, now I'm going to tell you about the fit, that nothing is the ground of reality. So, let's take an object, G. An O is not a great symbol, at least for a mathematician, because it's too easily confused with 0. So I stole G from the German. Gegenstand. Okay. So an object, G being something, that is being an object, depends on its being distinct from nothing. So this is another example of negative dependence. Because nothing is not an object, that's part of the paradox. So if G were the same in ontological states as nothing, then it would not be an object. So there's our counterfactual. So to be an object depends on being distinct from nothingness. Okay. Look at that picture. It could mean a couple of things. One thing it could mean is this. These are hills and these are the plain. To be a hill, you've got to stand out against the plain. Okay? You've got to be different in height. So, as you saw, to be a hill means to be distinct from the surrounding plain. But look, here's another meaning for the picture. Here is nothingness, the baseline, and these are the objects which stand out against nothingness. So to be an object means to be distinct from, to stand out against nothingness. And I can't claim that this is my view. I mean, this is original to me. I'll tell you who else held a view in a second. But if this is right, you can see that nothingness is literally the ground of reality. To be an object depends on nothingness. If there were no nothingness, there'd be nothing to stand out against, so there'd be no objects.
Is it not symmetrical though? Could you not just say the exact same thing, twisting it around and saying object of the ground because of the distinction from nothing?
Then you'd have to say that if there were no objects, nothing, what would the counterfactual be? If there were no nothing, there'd be no objects.
There'd be no nothing. It would be independent of the symmetrical.
Well, that's not obvious, because there could be just nothingness.
Don't planes depend on hills?
No. No, you've been to Central Australia.
We even have a few. Well, why not? I mean,
well, because it's
would
fact.
anyone have a concept of a plane?
I'm not talking about having a concept, I'm talking about the things in reality, not your thinking about them. I mean, look, the centre of Australia is flat, right? There are no hills, but there's one fucking great plain.
Well, in the Alps there are a whole bunch of Alpy things, but not a lot of plains.
Yeah, but there are plains surrounding the Alps. They go down to the sea.
There are hills surrounding Central Australia.
Sorry?
There are hills surrounding Central Australia. We're in some of them.
Yes. Okay, but I wasn't talking about that. I was talking about Central Australia and the fact that it's got no hill, it's flat.
Yeah, but so Dean's point was the Alps. There's no flatness. There's just all these hills. You said, oh well, there's a plain surrounding it, but the corresponding point applies to the plain of Central Australia.
That's fair enough. Okay, but just take Australia and wipe out the coastal ring.
Doesn't bear thinking about.
It doesn't bear thinking about, except as a thought experiment. And you can see that you can have a plain without any surrounding hills. I'm sure there are some Pacific islands that are like that, which are in dear danger. All right, look, we can carry on talking about this in the discussion, that's fine. I'm nearly finished now. Let me just draw some threads together. First of all, I said that this is not my view. It is my view, but it's other people's views. So there's another philosopher, a well-known philosopher, who had exactly this view. So this is Heidegger, and this quotation comes from Was ist Metaphysik. And this is what he says about nothing. Okay, the translators of Heidegger usually translate nothing. Okay, so the German is das Nicht, and translators usually translate it as the nothing. This is already something which makes it sound bizarre in English. Okay. This is a bad translation, and it's due to the fact that abstract nouns in German usually have a definite article, which they don't in English. Okay, so if you want to translate das Nicht into English, then the correct translation is nothing or nothing. Okay, so I've changed the translation. So nothing, this is Marty, nothing is neither an object, not any being at all. Nothing comes forward neither for itself nor next to beings to which it would, as it were, adhere. For human existence, nothing makes possible the openness of beings as such. So being is just an object, right? Nothing does not merely serve as the counter-concept of beings, rather it originally belongs to their essential unfolding as such. Well, the jargon is Heideggerian, but the sense is quite clear. And the sense is that, nothingness lays the opening which objects stand out against. And that's just what I've said in slightly more logician's terminology. All right, so let me conclude now. Meister Eckhart was a mystic, okay, and there are certainly mystical aspects of Heidegger as well. And their thinking about nothing was certainly mystical, both of them. There's been absolutely nothing mystical about what I've said. What I've said, and you may not like it for that reason, is cold, hard logic. I've explained to you why nothing is both something and no thing. That's a paradoxical object. I've explained why, in the sense that I've made clear, nothing is the ground of reality. So nothing is a paradoxical object. It's both an object and not an object. And it's the ground of all objects. So I'm not telling you that nothingness is God. I'm an atheist. It's certainly a very strange object, no doubt about that, but that's not a reason to worship it. But it's a perfectly good paradoxical object. And it's the ground of all objects. So let's skip that. So where we started was with this bent tag, ex nihilo omnis fit. Nothing is the ground of reality, and at the ground of reality lies paradox. Thank you.
Nathan.
You started with the Alice in Wonderland. I just wanted to give you an Eckartian version. An Eckhart version of that same joke. But Eckhart's being very serious. And here Eckhart is offering a reading of the first famous Jewish mystic, known as St. Paul. And there in Acts, Paul, on the road to Damascus, is blinded, and then he saw nothing. And of course, Meister Eckhart reads it, he saw the nothing. So it's very similar to...
Yeah,
actually,
no, that's... Can I say that it's a misunderstanding to say that Eckhart believed that God was nothing?
Oh no,
he doesn't say that.
It's behind God.
Sorry.
Look, I'm not an Eckhart scholar, so I stand to be corrected. But my understanding of Eckhart is that God is actually an object that stands out from nothingness, that the nothing is behind the God.
Not really, because you can't, he doesn't say that God is nothing, because it would be a something, as you said earlier on. So it's actually beyond, I think that's what you're saying, it's beyond both something and nothing.
Well, what he says is that God is not nothing, since, hold on, God is not nothing God is nothing in the sense of not being.
Okay, look, what we need to do is get the Eckhart texts out, because he wrote quite a lot on this stuff. But he certainly said that nothingness is the ground of being, in everything comes from not, the not. I mean, that's a legit quote, okay? His understanding of the relationship between nothingness as God, I'm happy to leave to Eckhart scholars to argue about. And I agree with the analysis of the road to Damascus. I think Lewis Carroll is funnier.
Harold, and then Chris. And then
I'm not sure whether. Oh yeah, that was. First of all, I think I love this argument. It's so fantastically deflationary.
Thank you.
Yeah. And then I wanted to say something for this asymmetry between the mountains and the plains. I would say if you have a plane at another level, then this would be the symmetric situation. You know what I mean? A plane at another altitude. I don't see the symmetry between the plane and the mountains, because the mountains have a completely different form. So how can I say this is symmetric?
It doesn't make sense. I mean, if there's only plane, then it's kind of hard to speak. You need the contrast in
The
both
concept
cases.
of the form is relational.
So what you're saying is, whether one is the background and the other is the foreground,
Exactly that.
is exactly the same as this is the foreground and that's the background.
That.
But then I wouldn't call symmetric. I mean, if of course it is symmetric formally. That's true. Okay, then, yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, it may be true that you can't have the concept for a hill without the concept for a plane, that's right. But as I said to Paul, we're not talking about the concepts, we're talking about the objects.
But
Okay.
we're using the concepts to talk about the objects, and then
I
using,
Of course,
using the concepts to
I
talk
have-
about the objects, and then using the objects as a basis of an analogy for nothing is the ground of reality.
No, I'm using the concepts to talk about the objects. You can't do anything else,
Yeah.
because anything you say is in language and so uses concepts.
Yeah.
But if I'm talking about you,
Yeah.
I use the concept Paul. But I'm not
It's not a
talking about the
concept,
concept,
it's a
I'm talking about you.
It's a name, it's not a concept. No, I mean, a concept, we've got the concept plane, we know the planes have various
Okay.
distinctions. We have a concept hill.
Call it a
And we
concept, call it a
understand
word.
We understand although I agree about the symmetry, we understand the basis of the analogy. But the problem is, we don't have a determinate concept of nothingness all alone.
Oh yes we do, and I gave you exactly what it was.
Well, that's one I've only just learned. And I'm
Good.
not too sure if I
I've-
understand it and why it's a concept of nothing. That's why. It's not like my concept of plane or my concept of hill.
Of course not, they're different things. Nothingness isn't a plane or a hill. But it's a determinate concept, I've defined it for you, okay?
Okay. Well, we defined it for yours, so I'm not too sure if it fits the rest of us. That's all.
Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Graham. That made my head hurt. I'm worried about your criterion of thinghood. I think it's too permissive. So you've said that for any x, x is a thing if there's some y such that y is identical to x. So counterexample, my reaching for the glass. There's a y that's identical to my reaching for the glass, namely my reaching for the glass, but that's not a thing, it's
Yes,
a
it is.
process.
Anything that is referred to by a noun phrase is a thing. Your reaching for the glass is a noun phrase.
I mean, if that's just your stipulative definition, if that's the way you're going to use the term thing as a term of art, then that's okay, but it sort of takes the bite out of saying that nothing is a thing, right? If that's just some technical term you've just defined as anything referred to by a noun phrase.
No, look, a noun phrase is something you can refer to, quantify over, anything which would be the object of a thought. Your reaching for the glass satisfies all those criteria. I mean, in English, the word thing is a bit of a portmanteau word, okay? And I am giving it a making it more precise. That's true.
Yeah.
But I am using the word thing, object, really in the way that most Western philosophers have used the word being. So this is not entirely perverse. Well, it's no more perverse than
The bulk of Western philosophy. All right, thanks. I think I almost have something to say in response to that, but I need to think about it more.
Ian first, and then Dave.
So the first thing I'm going to say is I'm now petrified about giving my talk. And the second thing I'll say is I actually, so I think I know what you're trying to say in this, because I spent the better part of a decade attempting to do exactly what you just did, and failed miserably. And only to realize that I think I was wrong about something. I'm not necessarily saying you're wrong about something, but anyway, that's for my talk. I have a legitimate question though. So I'm not very familiar with this pair-consistent logic stuff. So one of the issues I have with standard logic that and again, no offense to logicians, but logicians.
Can I just ask you to clarify what you mean by standard logic?
Okay, so that's a good question. I don't mean it in any formal sense. I mean it in the sense that is practiced by all the logicians I've ever spoken to. We'll say that.
Those are contemporary, presumably.
Presumably contemporaries. They're all
Okay.
still alive as far as I know.
Okay.
So I don't mean it in any formal sense. Okay. So or nor historical, whatever. But what has always bothered me is they all seem to kind of brush aside Gödel's stuff. They seem to just ignore that. And of course, and they say, well, and they sort of take it that I can use logic to say or prove anything. And you know, Gödel kind of tells us now. Gödel's theorems, there are many, but they very strictly, certainly at least within the realm that they apply to, say very specific things that there are truths that we can know within certain types of systems that we can't prove are true. So there are things that logic can't prove.
No, that's not a very accurate statement of Gödel's theorem, if I can be so bold to say
Doesn't Gödel
that.
apply exactly that logic that you think is what everybody applies?
Well, he says in an axiomat. So he says well, first of all, there are like 11 different theorems, but very roughly in an axiomatic system, there are statements that can be made that cannot be proved from within that system.
That's true, but
That's true.
that he proves by applying what you call standard logic, no?
Yeah, but of course the fact that they can't
Otherwise,
be
they'd be able
proved.
to prove anything using
Yeah.
this explosion feature. So he's
Yeah, look, the fact that you can't prove them in the system doesn't mean you can't prove them in other systems. And of
Right,
course
you
can.
have to step out of the system,
Sure.
but then you get in this.
Yeah, but it doesn't
Infinite
show that
regression.
there are things you can't know, that because you can know them because they're proven in a different system. Oh,
Right.
okay, but
I-
let me-
right.
but-
I agree with
but-
that.
But I mean,
Yeah, anyway.
let's not argue about the precise details of the theorem. What Gödel's theorem actually shows is this: that given any axiomatic system of certain strength, it's either inconsistent or incomplete.
Right.
Okay. Normally, the inconsistency option is ignored because it's taken to be proven in classical logic, which is governed by explosion. So if you can improve an inconsistency, you can improve everything, and everyone thinks that's crazy. Okay? But using a paraconsistent logic, you can have a complete inconsistent axiomatic theory of arithmetic, where the inconsistencies are very tightly quarantined because the principle of explosion does not work.
Okay, so that answers my question then. Okay, so it's the inconsistency part that all these people just ignore.
Yes, and if you look at these arithmetics, what you'll see is that in the classical logic case, you can prove neither the Gödel undecidable sentence nor its negation. But in the paraconsistent systems, you can prove both. They're
Okay.
contradictory, okay? But the undecidable sentence is no longer decidable. It's hyper-decidable. You've got it and its negation.
Okay, so it basically renders those theorems a moot point to some extent.
Well,
Ish.
it certainly says, you know, what should you expect arithmetic to be consistent? And most logicians will tell you yes. But if you look at Gödel's proof, it sails so close to the contradictory wind. And if you look at his construction, it's essentially the liar paradox in drag. And the liar paradox is, you know, a paradox that people have been struggling with now for 2,500 years. So there's a lot more to be said for the inconsistency of arithmetic than most contemporary logicians have given thought to.
David and then Adrian.
Three very short questions. I like to, because I don't work on logic, so I like to take advantage of your knowledge of Eastern thought to ask you about the application of contradictions or paradoxes in Eastern thought. The first one is for you, does perspective play a role in viewing something as contradictory in words?
Are you talking about Eastern logic or Eastern
Not
philosophy?
logic, just Eastern thought generally.
It depends. In some yes, in some no.
So the perspective of the two things involved in a contradictory relationship. Does your perspective of these two, in comparison to the perspective of somebody else, affect whether or not that relationship is contradictory or not?
No, but perspective plays no role in what I've said. Now, perspective does play some role in some Indian philosophical traditions like Jainism. And it plays a sort of sense in Buddhism because you've got two truths. But even though you've got the two truths, perspective does not necessarily play a role in the contradictions that lurk in Buddhism. Because you've got, as Dean said this morning, the Chaturshkoti, which tells you that even from one perspective, you can have contradictions. Okay, Jainism is a bit more complicated, but Jainism is quite consciously perspectival in a way that Buddhism isn't.
Right.
Do you have a Beheda
Sorry?
Do you have a Beheda in Shaivism? It means difference and non-difference.
Okay, I don't know, but Shaivism is Hindu.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
No, I was talking about Buddhism.
Sorry.
Sorry. So is this addressing crucial question? Addressing the last question. So,
Yeah, so
I
was
think you were answering it, but maybe you were answering the previous question.
I've lost track of who's asking. I have in mind, you don't really work in Taoism, so I have in mind arguments from that tradition, but I know you work in Buddhism. So an example in the text that Dean quoted this morning, the Zhuangzi, his friend, Huisher, is a logician.
Yeah.
And he has many paradoxes. One of which is,
yeah.
I leave for Sydney today and I arrived there yesterday. Now, that depends on perspective of time.
Well, okay. No one really knows what the arguments were because he just states the conclusions, right? And modern commentators try to reconstruct the argument. I'm not a scholar of these things,
Yeah.
and I leave it to scholars to try and reconstruct the argument. Maybe there's a sense of perspective going on, maybe not. Although the thing that Dean quoted this morning was not from the school of names. It was just
Yeah, it's just Ron's having fun with language.
it was just taking the piss,
Yeah.
right? As he often does.
It's a reductionist argument.
Yeah. But you're dead right that paradox plays an enormous role in the Taoist tradition.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the famous opening verse of the Tao Te Ching.
Yeah.
And of course, that's not a philosophical text, but it was defended by neo-Taoists 400 years later, like Wang Bei, who points out that the Tao is both effable. Well, he gives an argument that Tao is effable. Sorry, let me get this right. He gives an argument that Tao is ineffable, but of course he's talking about it, and that's bloody obvious,
Yeah.
right? So he's stuck with the paradox. Actually, he's got a couple of arguments in his commentary on the Tao Te Ching, and some of them are very much like Plotinus' argument about the ineffability of the one.
Yeah. Yeah. In terms of nothing is no thing. Does the fixity of said thing play a role in that being nothing or something?
Are you asking, can nothing change?
So nothing as no thing. Our
Well, nothing
understanding
is
of,
no thing.
of the negation of a thing assumes that that thing is somehow in a fixed state.
Well,
But
you
again,
can't-
using a Taoist argument, things are not in a state of permanency, things are always in a state of constant change or
Okay,
transformation.
so you can't negate things, at least in modern logic. You can negate statements or propositions or,
Right.
right? But you're quite right that in both Buddhist thought and Orthodox Chinese thought, everything is in a state of flux.
Yeah, because as you know, Mahayana, right, all things are empty. So you're not actually denying, I mean, things are without substance. Yeah. So what you're not denying is the internal state of things, but simply an outward form or shape, which is taken as representative of the authentic state of that thing. You have in mind, say, the argument of the golden lion. Right.
Okay, look, there are several things going on here.
Yeah.
Okay, the thought that everything is in a state of change goes back to the earliest Buddhism, not Mahayana. Okay, because it's picked up by the Mahayana, and it's a central part of Nagarjuna's arguments that everything is empty. Okay, but emptiness is the view that things are what they are, dependent on other things. So it's engi, as was said this morning.
Yeah.
The golden line is a Huayan text.
Yes.
Where according to the Indian Madhyamaka tradition, everything depends on some other things, which is why you get this regress. As far as I know, you don't get the claim that everything depends on everything else until Huayan Buddhism. So we're in China.
Yeah.
I may be wrong about that. If I am, please tell me. But anyway, certainly in those traditions, things are in a state of flux, right? Or change all the time. I haven't been defending either Taoism or Buddhism. I think there are things which are correct about both these traditions, but I'm not going to nail my colours to the mast of either of them. And you might want to say, do you think that nothingness is in a state of flux? Which I've never thought about.
I would say yes. I understand. In my own work, I speak of nothingness as a generative nothingness. It's not an empty void.
Yeah, that doesn't make it in a state of flux. I mean, in Christianity,
flux in
God,
terms of the emergence of being from.
Sure, but look, I mean that's in Christianity. God is a generator, but God is not in a state of flux.
Right.
So there's nothing about being a generator which implies being a state of flux.
Taoism as well. The Tao is not in a state of flux; it's in a state of constancy. But the things that it creates the condition for their emergence or birth, whatever you like, then those things are in a state of flux.
Yeah. Look, I think I'm happy to buy that. I mean, objects depend on nothingness in the sense that I've explained. I'm quite happy with the thought that at least objects in our phenomenological reality are in a state of flux all the time.
Right.
So I'm happy with that.
Okay.
Aidewan, did you have a question?
Yes, if we have time.
Yeah.
Thank you. A question related to thinkness of nothingness once again, because this was really discussed a lot in medieval times as well. So Arabic philosophers trying to make sense of Aristotle, they discuss whether nothing is something or not. What's interesting is that when they, sorry, it's not Aristotle actually, you're right. So
it's in Plato.
Yeah, maybe.
I can't think of anywhere in Aristotle.
Yeah. In any case, so what they say is something in many ways similar to what you argue, that is to say,
who's they? Sorry.
These are Avicenna and stuff. Maybe I might have time.
Oh,
to
sure. I mean, I'm sure there are very sophisticated discussions in the Arabic tradition.
Maybe not. I don't know.
No, I'm sure there are.
But what's interesting is that they argue that to be something, you need that entity needs to be able to become a predicate, as maybe you were talking about, to be a predicate of something else, of existence, of reality, so on and so forth. But then they argue that nothingness is not something precisely because it's, in order to become a predicate, it needs to be always a negation of something. So rather than being something, it is rather always a negation of something else.
Okay.
So I was wondering do you think that the division between nothing as a noun and nothing as a quantifier goes around that problem, the idea that nothingness is actually only a negation of something else?
Okay, look, Which philosophers are we talking about here?
Oh yeah, so this is basically the Arabic philosophical tradition. Avicenna and later the theologians as well.
Well,
they would argue that nothing is actually not something, but only a negation of something else.
okay, look, there's a lot of variety in Arabic thinking, okay? Al-Ghazali denies a lot of the things that Avicenna says, for example. So, I don't know the text well enough to comment on any particular texts. It would be terrific to sort of get them out and have a look, okay? So I can't answer the very general question, because we'd have to look at the specifics. But nothingness is not the negation of anything. It's a quantifier, or it's a noun phrase. It's not a logical operator like not, and, or. Okay. So the nouns, quantifier, phrases, grammatical conjunctions are just different parts of speech, and I'm sure they are in Arabic as well.
Yeah. They did not make that division that you really wisely make in the talk, that the quantifier and the noun, maybe because of the Arabic language, they just say it's always a negation of something, so it's not something at all. Yeah. And I guess that relates to the question about the hill and the plain as well. They cannot think about nothing other than being the opposite of something else, as if it's the absence of something, long story short.
Well, again, I think we'd have to get a look at the text, but there are texts by, now, what's the name of the guy who wrote a very famous story about someone brought up in a desert island?
Yes, Ibn Yaksan, Ibn Tufayl.
Him, yeah. So he has, I mean, he's obviously a Neoplatonist, right? Because when he gets to the discussion of what this guy comes to think about the ground of reality, they're full of Neoplatonic arguments, which are rather like, I mean, we talked about this, some of the arguments that you find in the Taoist tradition. And he says, oh, geez, I don't know what to say about this thing because I'm going to tie myself in knots. Because he's describing the ineffable. Actually, that's another interesting paradox. Describing the ineffable. Okay, so today I talked about nothingness being an object and not an object. You have to work very hard to wring another contradiction out of that, which is that it's both effable and ineffable. And this is core to any philosophical view, which says there are things which are ineffable and then explains why. And you find that in everyone from Nagarjuna, Plotinus, some of the Arabic philosophers, Heidegger, Wittgenstein, it's all over the place.
I was mentioning earlier, you find it in the rabbinical literature as well, where they're saying you really can't even call it the Ein Sof, because that's trying to label it too much, what is ineffable. So you shouldn't really give it any symbolic representation whatsoever.
Yeah, look, that's a tradition I'm not familiar with. This word Ein Sof, what language is it?
It's Hebrew.
It's Hebrew.
Yeah.
Okay.
I have a quick question first. So it's to do with this. It looks like you've got two different notions of nothing to me. I'm having trouble putting them together. So you start with the Mariological fusion, empty set version of nothingness, and then you end with this version of nothingness, which sounds a bit Neoplatonic. It's the ground of being. I can't see how those two are one and the same thing.
All right. So the definition is the one I gave you. That's Mariological. So being the ground of being is not a definition. It's one of the properties of nothingness. And the argument is the one that I gave you. Namely, there's a counterfactual dependence of things being an object on being distinct from nothingness. So it's a consequence of the definition, if you like. It's not another definition.
I still don't buy the lack of symmetry, but we'll talk about that. Maybe one more question, Jim.
Anybody else? Okay. Just a brief comment about Heidegger and about the opening remarks about Eckhart. Heidegger changed his views of nothingness after he came to Japan and had discussions with Hisamatsu, who we talked about this morning.
Hang on, Heidegger never went to Japan.
He had discussions with Hisamatsu Shinichi.
Well, some of the Japanese went to Freiburg.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Including Tanabe.
Japanese philosopher, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And And I think that the quotation that you gave is similar to the earlier Heidegger view, that the nothingness against which being discloses itself or reveals itself was the nothingness of death. It was a darkness, a privative, a negation.
Well, it's from the Vassis Metaphysics, which is 29, in fact.
Yes.
So it's the beginning of the Kehre.
Okay, and yeah, the beginning of the Kehre, okay. And afterwards, he began to see nothingness, I think, as a more, not so much a negation or privation, but as something more positive. And that also had to do with his relation with David's thought.
Yeah, look, certainly even in Vassis Metaphysic, he gives an argument that being is nothingness.
Yes.
I don't think it works, but he never resides from this as far as I'm aware.
But
so
this initial stance that death is behind everything and is threatening, and life appears against the background of death.
Yeah.
That's what he originally did with nothingness.
Well, that's in Sein and Zeit, of course, but there's nothing about that in Vassis Metaphysic.
Yes. Well, I think that carried on until later, and actually...
I'm not so sure.
Yeah.
I don't know of many discussions of death in Heidegger after Sein and Zeit.
No, not discussions of death. I'm saying this idea of nothingness as this idea of the darkness. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, I think the sermon that you're referring to in Meister Eckhart, Sermon 19.
Is it Sermon 19?
Yes.
Thank you. Because I didn't have the quote.
But the quote is not accurate. But,
good.
But there's two different
So
senses
what
of
should it be?
nothingness in it, I think. The first sense of nothingness is quantitative. And it refers to what someone mentioned before about St. Paul. Okay. St. Paul is on the road and he sees this, falls from his horse and he goes blind. And Eckhart says, what does Eckhart see? He sees nothing. Because it's all light.
Sure.
Nothing is visible because everything is light. So he's using that quantitatively. He sees nothing. And then he plays on that word and says, but the nothing he sees, that's God. So he changes the meaning of the word from a quantitative to something more positive. And then he says there was...
Well, that's not just changing the meaning of the word something more positive. That's naughty, because that's a confusion if he's doing that.
Oh, but Eckhart does this all the time. And then he says that there was a certain man that got pregnant with nothing, and he gave birth to God. Now, that's Eckhart's idea of the birth of God in the soul is a desert where there's nothing. Desert doesn't mean that it's the sand. It means that there's no orientation.
Good.
Okay? And the birth of God is like a spark, which is a little drop of nothing, a little drop of godness, of pure light. And that's where God comes to birth in the soul.
Okay.
That's what Eckhart's doing.
Good. So
actually, it's true that everything comes out of nothingness, but this comes to be. Fit doesn't mean made; it means comes to be. Right?
Yeah.
It becomes. That becoming is the work of God. So God is the one that adds being to nothingness. So things are nothing by themselves without the being that God adds to them.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Look,
so I think, but Eckhart, you're right. He's constantly changing. God is an adverb in many points, a bivot in Eckhart, and not a noun. So, yeah, that's his charm.
Okay. Look, I've said that the fact that the word nothing is ambiguous bedevils a lot of the discussion of nothingness.
Sure.
And I guess it's ambiguous in Latin, isn't it?
No, those are the German.
So you write in German? Oh, well, it's certainly ambiguous in German.
Yes.
Okay.
Latin is more traditional. Yeah.
So Eckhart wouldn't have been the first to be confused, or the last for that matter.
Oh, he wasn't confused. It was deliberate. He takes statements from Scripture and plays with the words and takes a meaning out of it. It's like a joke sometimes, a pun. It was every which direction with it, so.
Yeah, well, he wouldn't be the first philosopher to do that either.
Yes, sure.
Yeah, no, well, thank you. I'm not an Eckhart scholar, as I said. I've learned something about Eckhart. Thank you.
That's a good place to end, I would say, and say thank you, Graham. Okay, so we are in the same place we went yesterday, Echoes Restaurant, which is you go out the front doors and just take the left, and it's the first building you come to. 7 o'clock dinner tonight.
What's the relation, Graham, between dialectism and pragmatism logic? One part of the other, or no?